If there's one lesson the last 100 years of financial history has screamed at us, it's that currencies don't just die. They are killed, and the killer, almost every single time, is the very government that was supposed to protect them. Every collapse, from 1923 Berlin to 2023 Lebanon, tells the same story. A government decides it's smarter than the markets, wiser than math, and somehow immune to the consequences that have crushed every nation before it. It believes it can stretch debt to infinity, control interest rates, print money whenever it wants, and command inflation to disappear with a decree instead of discipline. But history is merciless to this kind of arrogance. Long before a currency dies, the warning signs are already there, clear as day, for anyone willing to look. The downfall of a currency doesn't start with hyperinflation. It doesn't begin with panic in the streets or people trading wheelbarrows of cash for a loaf of bread. No, the true beginning is much quieter, almost invisible. It starts with a single, simple assumption that governments can spend more than they earn without any consequences. At first, it seems harmless, even rational. The government has political pressures, wars to fund, unemployment to fix, or debts to pay off. The easiest path is always the same. Borrow more, print more, and push the problem into the future. The public barely notices. The early inflation is mild, sometimes even seen as a good thing. Economists pop up on TV to reassure everyone that the central bank has everything under control. And for a while, it actually seems like they do. But this is the subtle poison of monetary decay. It works, slowly and silently. And then suddenly, all at once, financial history is littered with governments that convince themselves they could outsmart the basic laws of economics. They claim they'll print just a little to stimulate growth. They swear that debt is only temporary. They promise inflation will stay low. But by the time they realize the machine has spiraled beyond their control, confidence, the true foundation of any currency, has already started to crack. Confidence, more than gold, more than GDP, and more than military might, is the invisible pillar holding a currency up. Once that pillar cracks, the whole structure collapses with terrifying speed. Yet governments always underestimate how fragile it is. Take the Weimar Republic after World War I. Germany didn't set out to destroy its currency. It just wanted to pay war reparations, rebuild its economy, and keep society stable. Printing money seemed like a painless solution, but every new banknote printed was a silent vote of no confidence in the future. Citizens noticed prices rising slightly, then more rapidly, then violently. By late 1923, they were literally burning money for heat because it had become cheaper than firewood. Or look at the Argentine peso, which has been destroyed multiple times in a single century. Politicians there always insisted they had found a new approach, a modern strategy, a temporary emergency measure. Yet every single measure boiled down to the same core mistake, believing that financial discipline can be suspended forever without consequence. The markets disagreed, and the markets always win. These collapses were not sudden disasters. They were slow-motion implosions, decades in the making, fueled by denial and political convenience. Governments often treat money like an abstract idea, something they can manipulate with speeches or laws. But money isn't political. Money is mathematical. And math has no mercy. The beginning of a currency's downfall is also psychological. When the public slowly realizes their government cares more about short-term political survival than long-term monetary stability, trust erodes. They start moving their savings offshore. They buy gold, dollars, or anything they believe can't be printed into oblivion. The government might accuse them of being unpatriotic, but in reality, they're just doing what's logical, protecting themselves from a predictable disaster. One of the most dangerous illusions in financial history is the belief that this time is different. Every government that destroyed its currency believed exactly that. They believed their country was unique, their institutions stronger, their plans smarter. They believed they could borrow endlessly because their bonds were safe. They thought they could print money without triggering a crisis because their economy was exceptional. But the laws of financial physics apply everywhere. Gravity pulls down every empire, and inflation pulls down every reckless currency. A key turning point, visible across a century of collapses, is when governments start attacking the symptoms instead of the cause. Instead of cutting spending or slowing money creation, they implement price controls, wage freezes, or capital restrictions. These are the final acts of denial, following a script written by every failed government before them. And they always end the same way, with shortages, black markets, and an even faster collapse in trust. This is exactly how the Soviet ruble died. It wasn't a sudden event. It was a death by 1,000 decrees, each one trying to control a market the government had already broken. When citizens lose the ability to convert their savings into real value, they stop believing in the currency altogether. Hyperinflation isn't just caused by printing money. It's caused by the loss of belief that the money being printed has any value at all. The United States, Europe, Japan, and other developed economies often point to their strong institutions as a shield against this kind of collapse. But history warns us that every country before them also believed its institutions were strong right up until the day they weren't. Currency destruction is the final chapter of long-term collective denial, not the opening scene. If there is one universal pattern, it is this. Governments destroy their currencies gradually, and then citizens abandon them suddenly. The slow decay is always government. The sudden collapse is always market-made, and the markets, unlike politicians, do not negotiate. The beginning of every currency's downfall is therefore not a crisis, it's a choice. A choice to prioritize short-term political wins over long-term financial health. A choice to disrespect economic fundamentals. A choice to believe that printing money is easier than making painful reforms. A choice to assume that people will keep trusting the currency, no matter how irresponsibly it's managed. But confidence, once it's damaged, rarely returns. This is why the first step in a currency's destruction is so subtle, yet so irreversible. It's the government's decision to treat money not as a responsibility, but as a tool. And once that decision is made, the rest of the story has already been written by a century of nations that learn too late what happens when you gamble with the value of your own money. If the first part of our story revealed the quiet, slow start of a currency's downfall, this second part uncovers the irresistible, predictable, and historically fatal temptation that governments just can't resist. The temptation to print money. They don't do it because it's wise or sustainable. They do it because it's the easiest political drug ever discovered. A quick fix that promises instant relief, while guaranteeing long-term ruin. The real tragedy is that this pattern is so familiar, so well documented across nations and centuries, that no government has an excuse for repeating it. And yet, they always do. Why? Because printing money is the political equivalent of switching off a fire alarm instead of putting out the fire. It silences the immediate problem and lets the architects of disasters sleep comfortably, at least until the building burns down. At first, printing money seems to solve everything. Debt gets cheaper. Public spending becomes painless. Banks become liquid. Markets calm down. Politicians can fund wars, social programs, subsidies, bailouts, and emergency support packages without raising taxes or facing public backlash. It feels like a miracle solution. But in financial history, miracle solutions are always illusions disguised as policy. The temptation starts subtly. A government faces a deficit. Raising taxes is unpopular. Cutting spending is political suicide. Borrowing is expensive, but the central bank, loyal, patient, and eager to support economic stability, offers an easier path. We can purchase your bonds. In simple terms, we can print money for you. This is how it always starts. Respectable, controlled, and justified. But like any addiction, the first dose is never the last. During World War I, European governments printed unprecedented amounts of money to finance the conflict. They promised that after the war, they'd rebalance the books. But after the war, rebuilding was expensive, unemployment was high, and there was no political appetite for austerity. So, the presses kept running. Germany took it the farthest, but no major power was innocent. Printing money became a habit, not a temporary fix. The same thing happened during the 2008 financial crisis. The US, Europe, Japan, and later almost every developed economy launched quantitative easing, a sophisticated euphemism for printing money. They insisted it was temporary, exceptional, and controlled. But by the time 2020 arrived, The money printing machine was already normalized. The pandemic simply gave governments a new justification to accelerate it. But this time was different. This time, governments believed they had evolved beyond consequences. They believed modern economics had rewritten the rules. They believed inflation was a relic of the past, and as always, confidence made them reckless. This brings us to the core political temptation. Printing money allows governments to maintain power without confronting reality. No politician wants to be remembered as the leader who cut pensions, raised taxes, ended subsidies, or admitted the country can't afford its lifestyle. Printing money postpones that day of reckoning. It buys votes, time, and temporary prosperity, but it also buys instability. Every major currency collapse in the last 100 years has a chapter describing the moment politicians realized printing money was easier than making hard decisions. In Argentina, it became a national tradition every time elections approached. Monetary expansion spiked. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe weaponized money printing to fund war veterans and secure political loyalty. In Yugoslavia, the government printed money to maintain the illusion of unity as the country fractured. In each case, leaders justified the printing with the same recycled arguments. It's only temporary. We need it to protect the people. Growth will fix everything later. Other countries are printing money too. Every one of these lines appears in the script of currency destruction. They appeared in Venezuela. They appeared in Brazil in the 1980s. They appeared in Turkey in the 1990s. They appeared in Weimar Germany, and they appear today in nations that believe they're immune to the lessons of the past. But printing money isn't just a political temptation. It's a mathematical trap. Once a currency is debased, inflation follows not immediately, but inevitably. And once inflation appears, governments face a dilemma. Admit the mistake and tighten policy, or deny reality and print even more. Financial history shows that nearly every government chooses denial. Tightening policy means recession, job losses, bankruptcies, and political fallout. Printing money means postponing the pain, and politicians almost always choose postponement over responsibility. This is when the cycle becomes irreversible. Stage 1 is stimulus printing. The government prints money to stimulate the economy. Asset prices rise, making the public feel wealthier. Everyone applauds. Stage 2 is maintenance printing. Costs rise, so the government prints more to maintain the standard of living. It blames external factors: greedy corporations, supply chain issues, foreign conspiracies. Stage 3 is emergency printing. Inflation accelerates. The government claims it needs to print even more money to help struggling households. The press praises this compassion, but the markets start to worry. Stage 4 is panic printing. Confidence collapses. The currency weakens. Prices soar. People rush to convert their savings into dollars, gold, or real assets. The government prints even more just to cover its own exploding expenses. Finally, Stage 5 is hyperinflation. The currency loses all meaning. Prices double in days. Shops reprice goods hourly. The economy disintegrates. The government blames speculators, smugglers, saboteurs, anyone except itself. This cycle has unfolded over and over for a century. Yet every new government claims it's different. Every central bank insists it has the tools to manage inflation. Every politician insists the printing is under control. Financial history proves that nobody controls an inflation spiral. The spiral controls them. What makes this political temptation so destructive is that its early benefits are visible, while its consequences are not. When governments print money, voters get subsidies, businesses get loans, banks get liquidity, and markets get a dose of artificial optimism. Nobody complains. Nobody protests. At first, inflation is mild, even pleasant. It feels like economic progress, but the real costs: the erosion of purchasing power, the collapse of savings, the loss of currency. Credibility emerges slowly. By the time the public realizes what has happened, the damage is irreversible. The most dangerous stage is when governments start to believe their own propaganda. When they convince themselves that inflation is transitory, that deficits don't matter, that creating money is harmless. When they claim, as some modern policymakers do, that governments can print without limit, because they control the currency. But controlling the currency is meaningless if you lose the trust of the people who use it. This is the great blind spot of political power. Governments see money as something they issue. Citizens see money as something they must rely on. When citizens lose faith, the currency disregardless of laws, propaganda, or promises. This is why the political temptation is so dangerous. It weaponizes short-term gain at the cost of long-term destruction. And once the printing begins, history shows only one outcome: accelerating decay. Confidence declines. Investors flee. Savers convert. Prices rise. Trust evaporates. The government blames everyone except itself. But the truth, written across a century of collapses, is brutally simple. Currencies are destroyed not by markets, not by foreign enemies, but by the governments that cannot resist the temptation to print. If you thought printing money was just a political trick, think again. What comes next is a predictable, self-reinforcing process of decay. It's a chain reaction so consistent that it's like financial déjà vu. Governments always believe they can control the consequences. But history shows that no one has ever tamed the machine once it's started. The mechanisms of monetary decay are mathematical, structural, and psychological. Once they're activated, they unfold with a cold indifference to political promises, and it always starts with distortion. When new money enters the system, it doesn't spread evenly. It flows first to banks, government contractors, and politically connected industries. This is the classic Cantillon effect. Those who get the new money first benefit enormously. They buy assets and expand their wealth before prices adjust for everyone else. The average person, who gets the money last, just faces the inflation that follows. This is the first mechanism of decay. Money printing directly increases inequality. It's not ideology, it's arithmetic. We saw it in the US after 2008, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Zimbabwe. Everywhere printing begins, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The second mechanism is the destruction of price signals. Money isn't just for buying things. It's a measuring tool. When governments flood the system with artificial cash, interest rates fall to unnaturally low levels. Borrowing becomes cheap, and risk becomes invisible. The economy gets intoxicated. Businesses borrow too much. Investors chase speculative bubbles, and consumers spend beyond their means. It all looks stable until reality reasserts itself. Printing money doesn't fix problems. It just hides them. In the 1920s, Germany printed money to support employment. Price signals broke down. Businesses made bad investments, and when the currency collapsed, entire industries went with it. The same thing happened in Japan in the 80s and the US in 2008. Every time, distorted money leads to distorted decisions. The third mechanism of decay is debt dependence. Once a government starts printing, it realizes it can pay for anything: stimulus, subsidies, wars, political promises. But this creates a new problem. The entire economy becomes dependent on this continuous flow of artificial cash. It's like a patient kept alive not by health, but by constant injections. Growth, consumption, and asset prices all become artificial. Eventually, the economy hits a critical point where it can't survive without more printing. This is the trap. Stopping the printing would cause an immediate collapse, but continuing it guarantees a future, larger collapse. There's no exit, only delay. And every delay makes the final disaster even bigger. The fourth mechanism is foreign flight. A currency isn't just used at home. It's held by foreign investors and governments. When they sense that a currency is being debased, they start selling. Sometimes quietly, sometimes all at once. And when they sell, the currency's value plummets. This is when politicians start blaming speculators or shadowy enemies for attacking the currency. But the truth is, currencies don't get attacked when they're strong. They get attacked when they're sick. When Turkey's lira collapsed in 2021, the government blamed foreign forces. The reality was simpler. Investors fled because Turkey was printing money while denying inflation. Foreign flight isn't a cause of decay. It's a symptom that the world has noticed the sickness. The fifth and perhaps most critical mechanism is the loss of domestic trust. A government can try to manage foreign outflows, but it cannot force its own citizens to trust a currency once that trust is broken. This loss of trust happens slowly, then all at once. It starts with people buying a few dollars or some gold, just in case. Then they buy property, or anything other than the local currency. Businesses stop offering long-term contracts. Salaries have to be renegotiated more frequently. Consumers rush to spend their money, knowing it will be worth less tomorrow. This behavior speeds up inflation, which in turn accelerates distrust. Once trust evaporates, a currency is already dead, long before the printing presses officially stop. The sixth mechanism is the breakdown of the institutions meant to protect the currency. Central banks claim to be independent, but history proves otherwise. When governments get desperate for money, that independence vanishes. The central bank becomes just another political tool. It cuts interest rates when it shouldn't, buys bonds it shouldn't, and pretends inflation isn't real. This institutional collapse has happened in every major currency crisis. In Argentina, Brazil, Turkey, Zimbabwe, the central banks became servants of political convenience long before hyperinflation took hold. The pattern is unmistakable. Currency decay is institutional decay. The seventh and final mechanism is the psychological tipping point. This is the moment people stop seeing money as a store of value and start treating it like a hot potato. It's when inflation transforms from an economic problem into a daily survival instinct. In Yugoslavia, people spent their paychecks the instant they got them. In Venezuela, bakers priced bread hourly. In Zimbabwe, the government printed a $100 trillion note that couldn't even buy lunch. This is the point when the currency stops functioning as money at all. And once that psychological switch flips, recovery is nearly impossible without a complete monetary reset. This is a tragedy of monetary decay. It's not one single event. It's a process, a sequence of mechanisms that kick in the moment a government chooses convenience over discipline. Distorted prices lead to bad decisions. Bad decisions create deficits. Deficits demand more printing. More printing destroys trust. And the loss of trust leads to total collapse. This is how governments destroy their own currencies. Not with one big mistake, but with 1,000 small, politically convenient decisions. And the most disturbing truth, every government believes it will be different. Every government thinks modern tools give it immunity from the lessons of history. But financial history has no exceptions. Currencies don't die because of outside attacks or conspiracies. They die because governments refuse to confront the mechanisms of decay they themselves set in motion. By the time you see a currency start to weaken, the game is already in motion. But this isn't just a simple chain reaction of bad economic news. Currency destruction is an architecture. It's a whole structural design that governments, financial institutions, and political systems build together, often without even realizing it. It's like a fragile scaffolding, pretending to support stability while actually speeding up the decay. This structure isn't built overnight. It's layered over decades, one policy at a time, one crisis after another. Each new layer is sold to the public as temporary, necessary, or the lesser of two evils. Eventually, what you're left with isn't a monetary system, but a monument to 2 decades of short-term thinking. And as financial history has shown us time and again, once this architecture is complete, collapse is no longer a question of if it's a question of when. At the very heart of this architecture lies the one institution that is supposed to prevent these disasters: the central bank. On paper, central banks are the guardians of stability. In practice, they often become the most sophisticated enablers of monetary decay. Now, no central banker wakes up and says, "Today, I'm going to destroy the currency." But they all wake up with one mission. Today, I must prevent a recession. And that's how it all begins. A small rate cut here, a liquidity injection there. Maybe a bond-buying program timed perfectly with an election cycle. And suddenly, the independent central bank becomes the financial arm of the ruling government. History is littered with these moments. Think of the Bank of Japan, which enabled the massive asset bubble of the 1980s. Or the Federal Reserve, which kept rates suppressed right before the 2008 housing collapse. Look at Brazil's central bank, losing all credibility during its hyperinflation years, or Turkey's cutting rates under direct political command, and Argentina's, which funded government deficits until the peso became a running joke. Every single collapse has the same tragic face. A central bank desperately trying to maintain the appearance of control long after they've lost it. Because once the money printing starts, there's no policy strong enough to reverse it without causing severe political pain. And politicians, as we know, absolutely refuse pain. So, the central banks compensate, adjust, expand, and distort. They build a tower of interventions on top of their initial failure. And that tower always falls. Now, let's talk about the silent partner in this architecture of collapse. Debt. Governments borrow because it's so much easier than raising taxes and far easier than cutting spending. Borrowing is politically invisible. The consequences are kicked down the road. The bill doesn't arrive until long after the people who racked up the debt are out of office. In the early stages, debt seems harmless. The markets absorb the bonds. Interest rates stay stable, and the economy keeps growing. But every government eventually crosses an invisible line, a threshold where debt is no longer just a fiscal tool, it becomes a political addiction. History shows us the same pattern over and over. In the 1920s, Germany borrowed to finance war reparations without raising taxes. In the 1970s, the UK borrowed so aggressively it needed an IMF bailout. Greece borrowed to fund a lifestyle its economy simply could not support. Argentina borrowed until defaulting became a regular cycle. Even the United States has borrowed trillions, believing its reserve currency status makes it immune to the consequences. Debt is never the direct cause of collapse, but it is always the foundation. It creates the fragility that money printing later exploits. Because once a government can no longer finance its deficits through borrowing, it turns to the printing press. And once that happens, collapse becomes structural, not just a cyclical downturn. But no currency collapses without the cooperation, whether active or passive, of the financial sector. Banks, investors, brokers, insurers, asset managers, pension funds, they all play a role in reinforcing this architecture of decay. Some participate willingly, others participate blindly, but all of them participate structurally. Why? It's simple. Inflated asset prices create profits. Cheap liquidity creates endless trading opportunities. Government bonds, no matter how risky, become collateral for more leverage. Even the weakness of the currency becomes another market to bet on. As long as the system keeps functioning, the financial sector is actually benefiting from all these distortions. Look at any collapse in history, and you'll find the exact same behavior. In Weimar Germany, banks leveraged hyperinflating credit to make a fortune. In Venezuela, insiders got access to US dollars at subsidized rates, profiting directly from the collapse. In Turkey, banks expanded credit even as the lira was falling apart. And in twos. Before 2008, banks packaged toxic mortgages into what they called AAA-rated illusions. The financial sector rarely resists destructive policy because it profits from the early stages of the decay. In fact, many collapses speed up because financial institutions amplify the distortions created by the government. They aren't villains. They are just incentives made flesh. They do what the system rewards them for doing. But when a system starts rewarding speculation over stability, collapse becomes inevitable. So where does the public fit into all this? At first, regular citizens trust the currency because they have no choice. They are paid in it, they are taxed in it, and they have to spend it to survive. This forced dependence actually delays the panic, but it also makes the final collapse even worse. The public typically goes through 4 predictable stages. First, there's denial. People believe the official story that inflation is just temporary. They start cutting back on non-essential spending. They adjust their budgets, and they trust the government's explanations. Next comes adaptation. People begin hoarding stable goods, things that hold their value. Businesses start changing their prices more frequently. Workers demand wage adjustments to keep up, and savings slowly start shifting into foreign currencies or physical assets like gold. Then, we reach the escape stage. Capital flight begins in earnest. Asset markets distort wildly, with things like real estate becoming a vehicle for people to escape the dying currency. black markets appear and flourish. Finally, there's rejection. The currency simply ceases to be money. People refuse to accept it for long-term contracts. Foreign currencies become dominant in everyday transactions. Dollarization, or using another country's stable currency, becomes a survival mechanism. By the time the public reaches this final stage, the currency is functionally dead even. If the government is still printing mountains of it, the architecture of collapse finally crumbles from the bottom up. A country suffering from monetary decay always ends up isolated on the world stage. Investors flee, credit dries up. Trade contracts get shorter and shorter. Foreign partners start demanding payment in stable, foreign currencies, and international lenders begin imposing humiliating conditions for any help. This isolation forces governments to act out of pure desperation. They impose price controls, capital controls, and forced currency conversions. They start arresting so-called speculators. They ration foreign exchange and might even limit how much money you can withdraw from your own bank account. These policies always fail because they're attacking the symptoms, not the root cause. This isolation only accelerates the collapse because it removes the only external stabilizer a country has: foreign confidence. Without it, the currency becomes a purely domestic illusion, propped up only by law, but completely unsupported by trust. And in the end, it is trust, not money printing, not gold reserves, not even GDP that keeps a currency alive. If you look at the last 100 years, it's like a graveyard of dead currencies. And now, in the 21st century, with all our fancy tech, instant transactions, and genius algorithms, we've proven one embarrassing truth. We've learned absolutely nothing. Nations have innovated everything except their ability to make the exact same monetary mistakes over and over again. Despite a century of collapses, panics, and money-printing frenzies, governments still act like economics is just a suggestion and consequences are optional. And we, the citizens, keep believing them, time and time again, right up until our savings vanish into thin air. Our money buys less and less. And the same old tragic story plays out, written in the ink of inflation and denial. This isn't the final chapter. It's a cycle, because the greatest financial tragedies aren't just events. They are patterns. Every failing empire, every currency turning to dust, every out-of-control inflation crisis starts with the same smug thought: this time is different. It wasn't different for Germany in 1923. When printing money felt like the patriotic thing to do. It wasn't different for Argentina through its endless devaluations. It wasn't different for Zimbabwe when they printed trillion-dollar bills like they were flyers. And it wasn't different for the Soviet Union, whose money system fell apart long before its government did. Yet today's leaders keep chanting that same mantra. They act like they can outsmart the basic laws of economics with a bit of confidence and a good press conference. Our policymakers have PhDs and slick PowerPoint presentations, but their core belief is shockingly naive. They think you can build prosperity on a mountain of debt, control markets forever, and just print value out of thin air, as long as nobody panics too quickly. But history doesn't care about feelings, and markets show no mercy. No government, no matter how special it thinks it is, can defy the laws of monetary gravity. Governments destroy their currencies in boardrooms, not on battlefields. You don't need an invading army or a civil war to wreck your money. All you need is the temptation, that quiet, persistent whisper, to pay for today's political promises with tomorrow's money. Inflation isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's a policy. It's the silent tax that no one ever has to vote on. It's like financial carbon monoxide poisoning. Odorless, invisible, and you only notice it when it's already too late. So why do nations keep using it, century after century? Because inflation punishes the powerless and rewards the powerful. It magically erases government debt while it eats away at your savings. It lets politicians spend money they don't have, making promises they can't afford to keep. Every generation thinks it has finally tamed inflation, and every single generation is proven wrong. Central banks were supposed to be the heroes of this story. They were created to protect our money, stabilize markets, and prevent crises. Instead, they became the arsonists of monetary history, constantly trying to put out fires with gasoline and then acting shocked when everything burns down again. Look at the pattern. It's always the same. First, the government spends way too much money. Then, the central bank prints more money to cover the debt. This causes prices to rise, which we call inflation. Then, the same central bank raises interest rates to fight the inflation it just created. This slows down the economy, makes debt more expensive, and triggers a crisis. And what's their brilliant solution? You guessed it. They print more money. It's a cycle so absurd. If you wrote it in a novel, people would say it is unbelievable. Yet, this is the foundation of global financial policy. Central banks act like they are both the guardrails and the cliff edge of our economy. They speak with authority, but act out of desperation. They preach about fiscal responsibility while printing money to fund government spending. They claim to be independent, but they're always there to bail out the system. If you want one phrase to define the financial history of the modern world, it's stability through instability. And the result is always predictable. A series of bubbles, bursts, bailouts, and temporary emergency measures that somehow become permanent. Debt is the great addiction of modern governments. 100 years ago, nations borrowed to fight wars. 50 years ago, they borrowed for social programs. Today, they borrow for everything. Infrastructure, subsidies, tax cuts, stimulus checks, bank rescues, corporate bailouts. Every single political problem is solved by taking on more debt. Every crisis is just another excuse for bigger deficits. Every downturn becomes a reason for more temporary emergency spending that never actually ends. Debt isn't just a tool anymore. It's the lifeblood of the entire system. But there is one lesson history screams louder than any other. No nation can outrun an exponential debt spiral. From the Roman Empire watering down its coins, to Great Britain losing its global dominance under the weight of war debts, to France collapsing into hyperinflation during its revolution. The ending is always the same. It's not always a dramatic, overnight collapse, but it is always inevitable. Debt is just borrowed time, and eventually, the clock always runs out. When a currency breaks, it's not just an economic event. It's a social earthquake. Money is the foundation of trust in a society. When you lose trust in your money, you lose trust in your institutions. When you lose trust in institutions, you lose trust in your government. And when you lose trust in your government, you start losing trust in each other. History shows this with brutal clarity. When Austria-Hungary's currency collapsed, its empire fell apart. When Yugoslavia experienced hyperinflation, its society fractured along ethnic and political lines. When Germany lost faith in its money after World War I, it opened the door to extremism and catastrophe. When money fails, the very fabric of society unravels. A government can survive protests, disapproval, even corruption, but no government can survive the moment its own people realize the money in their pockets is worthless. Despite all these warnings from history, modern nations continue to act as if public trust is an infinite resource that can never run out. So why don't they ever learn? After centuries of watching currencies fail, why do governments keep making the exact same mistakes? It's because the incentives never change. The people who print the money are never the ones who are destroyed when it collapses. The politicians who rack up the debt are long gone from office before the bill ever comes due. The central bankers who inflate the bubbles retire with awards and praise, not accountability. And it's the ordinary citizens, scattered and frustrated, who are left to quietly bear the cost. Monetary failure isn't just an economic problem. It's a political tradition. Nations don't learn because the people in charge never have to face the consequences of forgetting. The final warning from history is this: the destruction of a currency is never a mystery. It's never sudden, and it's never an accident. It is the slow, steady result of choices made over years, choices that were avoidable, obvious, and repeated by every generation that foolishly believed it was too smart to fail. If there is one lesson that echoes through the last century, one truth that rises above all the noise, it's this: governments don't destroy their currencies because they have to. They destroy them because they always think they can get away with it. And it's the public that always pays the price. In the end, a currency crisis isn't just a financial failure. It's a moral failure. A failure of discipline, of responsibility, and of honesty. And until our leaders confront that truth, the cycle will just continue. Because the destruction of money is really the destruction of trust. And when trust dies, history simply starts all over again, right where it left off.